Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Today, we're starting a new series on creating a healthy church culture. A culture is the way that people consciously or unconsciously do life together, and every church has a culture whether they realize it or not. Some cultures are healthy, others are not. In recent years, we've become somewhat accustomed to news headlines of celebrity pastors being exposed for moral failure or abusive leadership, often leaving behind a wake of hurt and pain for everyone involved. And that's not how things should be. The church is supposed to be a place of healing and goodness. So in this series, we're not only wanting to talk about what an unhealthy church culture might look like, but cast vision for how we as a church can embody a way of life together that, while it may not be perfect, is oriented towards goodness and kindness and love toward true flourishing. So let's get started. Today we want to talk about the power of culture, what it is, and why it matters. Let's get into it.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie.
And I'm Mac.
I'm Josiah.
Well, you guys, I was a little nervous coming into today. I was up at 2:30 this morning. My son Hudson woke me up. And I don't know about you guys, but like when I get woken up and it's anytime like after midnight, I just cannot fall back asleep. So, and I tried my best. I laid there for a full hour, went downstairs, read some books, watched some BBC. Long story short.
And that didn't do it. BBC
that didn't do it. I know. It's like, if anything will put me to sleep, BBC will. So I laid there for 2 hours. I did fall back asleep at like 4:30, I think, but then my alarm went off at 5:15. So, and I can't drink caffeine. As you know, I have an allergy to caffeine.
So sorry.
So I got up.
So if you're sluggish today in the conversation, you have an excuse.
I have an excuse.
We know why.
I got up though. I did the Peloton and I just sweat as hard as I possibly could. And I made myself a mud water, which has got like a teeny tiny bit of caffeine in it. But I don't know about you guys. I'm someone who just doesn't do well when I don't get sleep. I know some people can just kind of power through and be fine, but I am not one of those people. Are you, Mac?
It kind of depends. I can do it for a few days, but then if it starts to like accumulate, I feel that. So yeah, I can like go a few nights without great sleep, but if it starts to accumulate, it definitely has an impact on my day-to-day functioning.
Yeah. Yeah, I often I'm low on sleep. Honestly, I can't remember the last time I had like a full night where I could sleep as much as I needed to.
You guys.
I'm really bad at it.
Study after study shows the importance.
Oh, you don't have to tell me.
Sleep.
Yeah.
I'm in bed by 9:00. I just can't get myself to fall back asleep. Are you?
You should share the study with her son.
Yes.
Yeah,
he
there you
knows.
go.
Yeah.
Are you? Is that because you stay up too late?
Yeah, I guess for part of my life. I don't necessarily do it on purpose anymore. Sometimes life is just busy, but there was definitely times, especially in my 20s, even though I was raising kids, there's just something about having to go to bed that feels like a chore. And so you feel like you're trying to like suck the life out of every day. I don't know.
Oh,
Okay,
my
I could not
goodness.
feel any differently, Josiah.
Like when I have to go to bed.
I daydream about going to bed.
Yeah, if I force myself to go to bed, it's like, okay, fine. I don't know.
My mind. I'll put my pajamas on at like 6:00. I got my essential oils going next to my pillow.
Wow.
I love crawling into bed.
Yeah, I know I probably should, and I definitely feel better when I do. But I've gotten pretty used to life without a lot of sleep, I guess. It's probably, maybe this is a wake-up call for me. Maybe I should
There you go.
care about it more.
Yeah, dude. I'm with Katie on this one. Josie started a new job where she begins very early in the morning. Like she's up in 4:50 to get to work. And so she's wanting to go to bed earlier. And there is no, like the nights where she's like, hey, I need to get to bed early. I'm like, yes. Just means more sleep. I'm going to be better tomorrow.
Way. Yeah.
I'm worthless after about 8:43 at night. Like I'm just I'm my best self for the first half of the day. And then from there, it's hanging on.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah,
That's how I feel. Nothing good's happening anyways.
I definitely don't feel like that. I remember there was a moment, I have 4 kids, and only one of them was a good sleeper. The first 3 were, it was it was just such a fight and a battle when they were infants. And I remember this moment where I kind of just realized that if I'm going to be happy instead of being frustrated, I'm just going to assume that I'll never sleep again.
Gosh, sounds
And
terrible.
whatever sleep I do get, I'll be grateful for. I just got so used to like running on almost nothing. And
You lowered your expectations.
yeah, I had to. But maybe I should revisit that.
Might be a good idea.
Well, speaking of putting people to sleep, do you want to introduce our topic?
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, so today we want to start a new series on creating a healthy church culture. So I think it'd be a good idea to share, before we get too far into it, share with our listeners the why or the whys driving this series. So what are some of the reasons why we're starting this new series, and why is it important to talk about church culture?
Yeah, one that I would share is just because I think there's an obvious gap here between what the church is supposed to be and what the church actually is. I mean, the church is supposed to be an embodiment of good news, of the good news of Jesus. The church is supposed to be a place of healing, a hospital for the hurting. The church is supposed to be a place of goodness and peace and wholeness. It's supposed to be a place marked by and characterized by love. We as a community are to embody the good news of Jesus together in the way we do life. But if we get honest, oftentimes that's just not the case. There's this gap between what we're supposed to be and who we actually are. And I think in this cultural moment, we're just kind of inundated with all these failures amongst pastoral leaders and elder teams, et cetera. And so it just highlights that this is just such a massive problem. Instead of being a place of healing, the church has become, for many people, a place of hurt. Instead of being a place of goodness, it's been a place of deep brokenness. And I just sit in the tension of wanting to acknowledge that the church often falls short, and we fall short. Like, no church is ever going to be perfect. Mm-hmm. We're not perfect. There will always be a gap there. And yet at the same time, I feel the tension of, I really don't want to give up on the redemptive potential of the church. Yeah. I'm eager to help close that gap, knowing we'll never be perfect. What would you guys add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the church is full of people, and people aren't perfect. So you get any group of people together, and you're going to have lots of problems. Mm-hmm. And I think it's easy to get disillusioned with the church because, again, it's the church. This should be the one place where we're living into the life Jesus calls us to. So yeah, I hear you saying that there is a gap there, and we need to notice that gap. And I would add that I think it's that gap in the church is noticeable on a broad level. Like, church failures are becoming the norm, which is kind of sad. I feel like there's constantly headlines of celebrity pastors being exposed for moral failure or abusive leadership. And sadly, now it barely phases me when I see another one. Mm-hmm. It's like, yep, there's another one. Oh, yep, there's another one. Just in the past, decade, we had Mark Driscoll. If you're not familiar with that, Spotify did a whole podcast on it called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. There was Bill Hybels at Willow Creek, James McDonald at Harvest Bible, Ravi Zacharias. That one I remember being a shocker to me. I listened to him a bit in law school, and that one really took me by surprise. And let's not forget the elephant that is the Southern Baptist Convention, where sexual abuse was discovered to be so rampant that the Federal Department of Justice came in and is leading an investigation. And if you're not familiar with that, you can just Google it. The details are really hard to read. So this is really sad, again, and it's not just about the downfall of one person. I think when one person, engages in this abusive culture, it leaves behind like a wake of hurt and pain for everyone involved. Mm-hmm. I talked about this in a past episode, but talking about like the Church Too movement has grown out of this, right? We had the Me Too movement, which called attention to sexual harassment in the entertainment industry. From there, it kind of bled into academia, the corporate world, and then the faith world too. So you had the hashtag Church Too coined, and you saw victims of like sexual abuse by clergy and other leaders of the faith coming out in droves. So widespread problem, not limited to the church, but certainly rampant within the church, and people are leaving communities of faith altogether because of it.
Tish Harrison Warren said this to confirm your point. We don't just have a few bad apples. It's something systemic. It's something cultural. We have a cultural problem that results in patterns of abuse repeated again and again in different locations, traditions, and ecclesial contexts. There are too many stories to ignore the pattern. So maybe to interact with what you're saying, I want to affirm, like, this is a problem on a broader level. This gap is noticeable on a broad level. I also wonder, too, I think there are probably a lot of healthy churches that don't get the publicity. You know, there are a lot of really awesome church communities that are living this out in relatively healthy ways. And we obviously live in a day and age where that just doesn't get, that's not the story headline, you know? What captivates people's attention is the dirty details, you know? But there are so many of those headlines that, yes, we've kind of become used to it. And that's tragic. So I guess 2 reasons, just to summarize so far, is to say, number 1, this gap exists in every church. 2, it seems to be a gap on a very broad level, so it's unignorable.
Yeah.
You know, what else?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting, the statement that everyone, that nobody's perfect can become a little cliche. Because although, of course, we are not perfect and no church will ever attain this perfection type of goal maybe some people have in their minds, that nobody would ever get hurt in a church community ever. The problem is when you notice the gap is there, what do you do about it? And often it gets either covered up or dismissed, because the problem isn't necessarily just when churches fail. The problem is also how the churches respond when people do fail.
Totally.
So if you have expected that people are going to fail, you should probably have a bit of a plan on what does it look like to clean up a mess. And unfortunately, the responses all too often have been to protect the reputation of the church by denying or covering up failure, and often blaming victims for accusing when really they're the ones who have been victimized. Protecting a brand of a church or a ministry over the person, which is interesting. It's sort of the opposite of what Paul did when he addressed some of these issues within his letters. He talked about addressing it openly in front of the church. But often, what do we see? Things get covered up. We try to manage publicity, and this ends up eroding trust and prioritizes some sort of reputation and position over genuine ministry and pastoral care.
Yeah. Totally. It's almost like we try to cover it up in the name of quote unquote saving face for God, right?
Yeah.
Like, lest word get out that the church isn't perfect, people might have a bad impression of the church or God. Where did we get that idea, right? That's nowhere in the Bible. As Christ followers, we're called to be truth tellers and justice seekers. And so often, I think you're right, Josiah, I think we see the opposite. Going back to the SBC that I just mentioned, it's not just a few bad apples. You saw secrecy at every turn to cover it up, right? There was this sham investigation and then that sham investigation, and then they wouldn't release records and they would only let certain people in the room. And that's the reason that they're now under federal investigation, right? People do bad things, but when you look at the institution, you have to ask, okay, well, what are you doing about it to respond to that? Is there accountability? Is there transparency? Or are you turning a blind eye? And if you turn a blind eye, you shouldn't be surprised when it happens again.
Yeah. And instead of focusing on the person who's been hurt, the victim, those who have been wounded, instead we blame those people and then protect the institution, the pastor, our reputation. In other words, instead of being other-centered, we become self-centered. The church has become self-centered and protected their self-interest. And that seems to be a common response. I'm sure we'll get into it later in the series of sort of how institutionalism and maybe a lead pastor-centric model when there's problems lead to that type of protective mentality where we don't deal with reality, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the third reason goes right along with that, which we've already kind of touched on, is just that this gap exists to some degree in every church. And if you think that your church does not have a gap, then you're very wrong.
Yes.
Right? We just named that none of us are perfect. We're broken people all trying to figure out how to follow Jesus and do life together. It's going to get messy. The problem is when we don't know how to address it, right? So unhealthy church culture, toxic leadership aren't only found in mega churches and in large-scale screw-ups we see on headlines, right? There are all of us who exist within smaller churches and smaller communities. We all have experienced issues in church hurt and a lack of integrity within leadership and within other areas, right? So if we're going to be imperfect, then we have to know what we're going to do when it's time to address it.
Yeah. He just said a lot. First of all, he said that we're all imperfect people. So this gap that exists in the church exists in each one of our own lives.
Yeah.
We're never going to be perfect. This side of heaven, we'll never be perfect. But we are, in cooperation with the Spirit of God, charged to work on our own transformation by participating with the Spirit, right? So we're all individually seeking to close this gap. And as a community of people who share that goal, we're to be closing that gap together. You also said, and I think this is really insightful, because often the big churches are the ones in the news. This isn't just a big church problem, although I think there are some key ingredients that make it more likely to be a problem in a big church. This is also can happen in a smaller church or smaller communities where we've experienced it. It is painful when these types of dynamics begin to take over. And I think unless a church actively resists a dysfunctional church culture, that becomes the norm.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I think there are some key ingredients. The bigger the church gets, it seems like the more susceptible it is. And I would just agree with that, especially within evangelicalism. It feels like, when you get these churches that get so big, there's something kind of inherent about becoming big that makes it really hard to do that work for some reason. It's like we get really focused on being big and growing in numbers. And I feel like the bigger you are, the harder it is to be faithful, maybe. It's not impossible.
Well, I wonder if it's the reason why you've gotten so big as a church may have been compromising some of these values of having a healthy church culture. Maybe that's how they got there.
Yeah.
Maybe worth considering.
I wouldn't want to turn this is just me. Maybe you guys don't agree. I wouldn't want to turn this into like a big church versus small church type deal. I think big churches, because of the philosophy of ministry that they might be pivoting out of, are more susceptible to some of these problems. But it seems that the point Josiah was making is that this is an all church. This is a universal problem. Scott McKnight said this: in the absence of a culture that resists abuse and promotes healing, safety, and spiritual growth, the heartbreaking turret is that churches of all shapes and sizes are susceptible to abuses of power, sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse. My guess is that I know firsthand from some of my work with the Leader's Journey, et cetera, this is happening in smaller churches that nobody's aware of.
Yeah, for sure. And if we are going to address this topic, I think one of the things that should be our first reaction is when you see something like a headline, you see a church screw up, you see this, your reaction can either be to point a finger and to talk about it in sort of a prideful, arrogant way.
Yeah.
Or it can be to first sit back and consider myself first. Like if I'm going to point out and recognize the flaws and injustice in someone else, I first need to do the work in my own heart to be like, where does this exist within me? And I think as we approach it from a place of humility, I think that we're much more likely to see some of our own gaps. Think about it when I think it's just so natural to be like, as a human, to when you see someone else screw up, your reaction can so easily be to point it out. And why? Because now the focus is on someone else. I don't have to think about my own insecurities or my own shortcomings. But as Christians, we can be secure in knowing that, we are going to make mistakes. We are not perfect. And we know that God loves us and accepts us. And we can approach these things knowing that, hey, we can be an open book because whatever we see, God already knows. And we can expose that because we want to be not only healthier as people, but largely a healthy community. That's
such a good word. And that is I hope that's the tone that we are able to maintain throughout this series, that as we draw attention to some of these things, it's not to sort of from a lofty place, a place of self-righteousness, go, hey, we're not like that. It's to look at that and actually allow it to become a mirror so that we examine ourselves. And not just on the surface level, but in the depths of our hearts, so that we can become the kind of people that live into a community of goodness.
Yeah.
I think the final reason why we're doing this is not just a conversation I think we're hoping people would listen to and be entertained by, but if you're part of Crosspoint, we want your help in closing this gap. And this is where maybe a basic understanding of systems theory is helpful, because, well, here's the deal. The culture of a church is the sum total of everyone's participation. So that means that everyone in the church plays some role and has some responsibility for the culture that exists within it. Now, that's not to say that everyone's responsibility or role is equal. Leaders clearly have a higher degree of responsibility when it comes to the culture that exists, but it is never without the congregation's participation. So while it's true that leaders have greater influence on the formation of culture, it's more accurate to say that leaders and congregations form church culture together. And over time, it's the interaction of leaders and the congregation interacting with the leaders that the culture begins to form and take shape. So in this sense, everyone's involved, even if you're just complicit by not participating. You're involved in some way. And so, for instance, in a culture where the lead pastor is exposed for abusive leadership or toxic behavior or whatever it is, oftentimes what you'll discover is there were bystanders watching all along or ignoring all along who didn't do anything. And they were, in a sense, participating in the culture that ended up taking shape. You know, a story after story shows elder boards who, even though the lead pastor was not sort of inhabiting healthy or whole leadership, chose to look away for all sorts of reasons. Perhaps they trusted the pastor in a sort of a blind trust kind of way. Perhaps they saw numerical growth, and because things were growing, they assumed it was okay. Perhaps they were friends with the pastor. Many leadership teams are just comprised of the pastor's friends. There's all kinds of reasons, but the point is it wasn't just the dysfunctional pastor that created the culture. It was other people allowing that to happen along the way. So the congregational interaction between leaders and others who are present shapes the culture. And so that means that for those of you that are listening, we're inviting you to help shape a healthy culture with us, right?
Yeah, because we're not talking about this just to make sure that nobody in leadership screws up. We're talking about this because we want everyone here, including the leadership, which is also a part of the community, to experience wholeness and flourishing within a church community that allows everyone to do so. So it's not just a check and balance to make sure a leader doesn't make too many bad decisions or to abuse people. Of course, that is a huge part of it. But the why behind it is because we have a vision of a church body in which Christ is the head of, in which we all get to experience the benefits and the flourishing that happens from being a part of his kingdom. And we want our church community to experience as much of that as possible.
Yeah, and the more everyone pursues it,
yes,
the healthier we will be. So we're inviting you into this work with us, is the point. So let's, we've used this word culture quite a bit, and I want to begin to kind of help our listeners wrap their minds around what we mean by that. What I am excited about in this series is that there's a lot of people talking about this cultural gap we've been naming. And so it's not like we're just coming up with this. There's tons of voices that have been helpful. So I'm just going to mention a few for maybe some of our listeners who are big readers or who want to take a deeper dive. There's a great book by Diane Langberg called Redeeming Power, where she gets into power dynamics within the church. Super insightful. Caitlin Beatty has written an awesome book called Celebrities for Jesus, where she gets after some of that megachurch type stuff and some of the problems within it. Chuck DeGroat, which we'll be doing a deep dive into later in the series, has written a great book called When Narcissism Comes to the Church. Kyle Strobel, The Way of the Dragon and the Way of the Lamb. Again, how power shows up and whether it's cruciform or not. And then one book that I really liked by David Johnson and Jeff Van Vonderen is The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. In this series, though, and I know this is just the first episode, there are two resources we're going to be relying on more heavily than any of those. And that is a book entitled Church Called Tove by Scott McKnight and his daughter, Laura Beringer. And then they wrote a sequel called Pivot. And we've been kind of reading that and studying it over the last several months and are going to be kind of channeling some of the core content in a way that is applicable to our community. So I hope that list is helpful for anybody who's wanting to go, okay, let's do a deeper dive as we lean into this series. But Katie, why don't you help us understand what we're talking about when we talk about culture?
Speaking of the Scott McKnight and Laura Beringer book, that's the book I picked up at 2:30 in the morning. I reread, not because it's boring. I really enjoyed it, but I just reread a couple of the chapters to refresh my memory for today. It's
a great resource.
It is.
By the way, the word Tove is a Hebrew word, and it means good. So Church Called Tove, that's the focus. It's about being a good church, a church defined by goodness.
Yeah, so what is culture? I think culture is just essentially the way people do life together, to put it simply. And that could be consciously or unconsciously. So in the job I had before I came to Crosspoint, I was head of compliance for the UW system. And when most people think of compliance, they think of like laws and rules and policies. And that's fair. Like if you want to tell if an organization or a person is compliant, you want to know like, okay, what laws and policies apply to them and are they following them? But the longer I did that work, the more I realized that the policies on paper are far from the whole picture. If you want to get to know an organization, whether let's say it's like a school you're considering attending or a company you're thinking about working for or a church you may want to attend, you're going to want to get to know the culture. How do people act? How do they speak? What sorts of behaviors are praised in that organization? What sorts of behaviors are frowned upon? Do they say one thing, but in reality, they do another thing? So there's plenty of organizations that I think have value statements about honesty, integrity, fairness, transparency. They may have a handbook, but in order to find out what they really embrace, you need to look at the culture, like the way they function day in and day out, even when they think no one's looking. Would you guys have anything to add to that?
No, I think you're spot on. I think that it's the way we end up doing life consciously or unconsciously. And the way to get at that is how are people actually functioning in this space? What are the habits? What are the patterns? What are the ways of relating? And sometimes it is consistent with policies and things that they like values that have been written down. Sometimes there's a radical break or sort of discontinuity between those two. And we started this entire podcast talking about our values. Mm-hmm. And so that's really hard work. I mean, I guess what I would say is like the ability to align what's on paper with how we actually live is hard work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a pastor can get up on stage and announce a policy change. Hey, we're going to be doing this, or a change in doctrinal belief or whatever. That doesn't change the culture. Right? Culture change takes time. It's got to kind of seep into the lifeblood of the system.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of some of these major church failures where there's been like abuse, sexual abuse, things like that. There's no one, I would imagine, almost no one unless you're there for completely the wrong reasons, that starts out wanting to build a church culture in which allows someone to abuse someone in that way. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So no one's going to state it as their value. It's not going to be listed on a piece of paper that says we value covering up problems so that we can do whatever we want here. No one's going to state that. But for some reason, these things still happen in church communities that are designed to be places of sanctuary from the problems. So the culture is a better, like when we get into the nitty gritty of what creates some of these problems, that's why we're talking about culture, because it's not something that you can necessarily define on a piece of paper. these are the things that end up creating the problems in which we see.
Yeah, let me go back to the university context, just as an example. Let's say there's an investigation for sexual abuse or rampant sexual harassment, and you get an investigation, okay? If I'm the compliance person, it's not enough for me to go, okay, but look, we have this policy that says that sexual harassment is not okay. They're going to be saying, yeah, but okay, how do people speak to each other? Do you allow people to make these kinds of comments? How is it addressed when they do that? How do these types of people feel in that environment? Like, what's going on in the day-to-day? And it is much harder to pin down. But those are the types of things that make up the culture. It doesn't matter what you say you're about if it's not actually present in reality, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in a way, culture is the reality of how people behave and relate and interact. It's reality.
Yeah.
The culture that's in place reflects the reality of how people participate and relate to one another in that shared space.
Yeah.
Yeah, and along with that, I think the obvious leading to that is that every church has a culture, whether you realize it or not. It's kind of like kind of the analogy of like a fish may not notice the water it swims in, but it doesn't mean that what's in the water isn't affecting it. All of us are fish in a bowl, and the culture we are in is the water in which we swim.
Yeah.
So that can influence us positively or negatively. And quite frankly, the less we notice or are aware of that culture, sometimes the more it can influence us, especially for the negative. So yeah, I think that maybe we don't even realize how many of our belief systems are formed from these cultures in which we either grew up in or are currently in.
Yes.
I think a lot of us would like to say that our beliefs are based out of Scripture, and I'm not saying that many of them aren't, but many of those unconscious belief systems that are impacted by and ultimately impact the culture we're in are formed based upon the water we were swimming in.
Yeah, it's like there's no unenculturated person in any place in the world, right? We're all part of a culture. And if you're part of a church, that church has a culture. And on one level, this is really obvious. I mean, if you were to go to any church, you might notice that, hey, they dress differently than the church that I go to. They're all wearing suits and ties. Or, hey, their worship is very different. They only sing hymns, and there's like a full band or what. Those are cultural pieces, right?
Yeah.
But I think we're wanting to go a little bit deeper and go, but what are the values that are sort of at play in the way that leaders and congregants interact over time? Not just those like beliefs, not just the liturgy, not just the clothes people wear, but like the things that inform goodness, the ways of relating that determine, how pastors function, how people show up and relate to it, like all the things you were naming, Katie, like how does a person feel in this place? Like all those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's a metaphor that I would like to share with you. And I didn't come up with it. It was in one of their books, either Church Called Tove or Pivot, might have been Pivot. But Scott and Laura talk about how they encourage us to think through like subcultures. So we got the big idea of a culture, and then they name 3 subcultures. And they use the example of a tree. So the first subculture would be like the leaves and the fruit on a tree. Then you have sort of the second subculture would be the trunk and the branches, which obviously supply nutrients to the leaves and the fruit. But then the third subculture that they name is actually beneath the surface, and it's the soil. And they name that like the soil ultimately determines, everything. If the soil is full of toxic elements, the tree isn't going to be able to produce healthy fruit. It may not be able to produce fruit at all. The tree may eventually die. And so in terms of priority within those 3 subcultures, they name like the soil matters the most. It's kind of like this. My mom is sort of a plant fanatic. She has like almost 50 plants in her home. And I mean, just before Christmas, she stopped by the office here and brought me a plant. So she's brought me plants. I'm not a plant person. So I asked for instructions. What do I do to take care of this plant, et cetera, et cetera. So this past spring, I noticed a couple of my plants weren't doing very well in my office. And I'm like, I don't know what to do about this. And one day I was leaving for work and noticed a bag in my garage on the shelf just said fertilizer. So I thought, well, maybe it needs some nutrients. And so I brought this bag of fertilizer in and just spooned, like there are these little pellets. So I just started to kind of spoon some of those in the soil, mixed it up, and then watered it. Big mistake. Okay, big mistake. First of all, it was like organic fertilizer, so it smelled like poop. And I actually got a call from our cleaning lady, a text from our cleaning lady like a day later, like something's dying in your office. And I was like, no, my bad.
I think I borrowed you my diffuser for a couple days.
Yeah, it was so bad. It smelled awful. So joke was on me. But the other thing is like I put way too much in. Like it's supposed to enrich the soil. It did the exact opposite because I didn't put the right amounts in it. So it had a detrimental effect on every one of the plants. And then Patty Burns, who's on our staff, like rescued my plants and replanted them and did a bunch of work. And so I'm okay. But it goes to this point that the work of culture formation is attending to the soil.
Yeah.
It's not just attending to what's visible, the leaves, the fruit on the tree. If we look at some of the bigger mega churches on the from an outside perspective or on the surface, things can look healthy, right? Mm-hmm. On paper, the policy may sound right. Mm-hmm. But the work of culture formation is actually getting underneath the surface and looking at the elements in the soil. Is the soil itself healthy? If so, it will lead to healthy disciples in a community of goodness. Or are there toxic elements in the soil that don't allow for good things to grow?
Yeah. Yeah, when you say unhealthy soil, it makes me think of things like favoritism, lack of transparency we've talked about, cutting corners, right? Like, is the outcome more important than the way we get there? Pursuing outcomes no matter the cost. Prioritizing like a public-facing image over internal culture or morale. These are all things that we tend to see come out in unhealthy cultures. And then healthy soil, to me, looks like treating everyone in the church or the organization as human beings worthy of dignity and respect, like no matter what position they hold, right? Is the janitor treated the same as the lead pastor? It looks like accountability, holding people accountable for their actions. Again, no matter how high up they are in an organization. And frankly, if anything, more accountability, the higher up you are, as opposed to the opposite. Like if you're a senior leader, there should be stronger repercussions for abusing that power because you have more power to wield. It looks like consistency, where we actually do the things that we say we're going to do, et cetera. Those are some examples that come to mind for me of healthy and unhealthy soil. Can you guys think of any examples and how you've maybe seen a gap and addressed that?
Well, I mean, okay. Well, one example, and I may have shared this before, but when I first joined our staff team years and years ago, there was like a rampant gossip problem. And it was well known. I mean, we did like staff culture surveys and it came back like, yep, this is a major problem. We're not just talking triangles. We're talking like pentagons everywhere. Like this person talks to that person who talks to that person and finally gets back. It was horrible. And so, you know, when we underwent a major shift, this was one of the elements that we had to attend to. We actually did a toxic remnant exercise where we said, what are the toxic ways of relating and behaving that we've all lived into? And like, so let's label those. And then of those, how are we going to commit to embodying something different? And this was one of them. Gossip was a big deal. It was almost like key to survival in our former way of relating and behaving. And to make a commitment that, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to talk to each other, not about each other, was a big deal. And it took time and repetition to actually have that culture change from one of gossip to one of transparency and trust.
Yeah.
That'd be an example.
Yeah. And I think in that example, and I was there for it too, I think the interesting thing is if you just address, hey, stop gossiping, and you're looking at the fruit, right, of like poor relational connectedness and like all those things, you can see the fruit and say, hey, stop gossiping, and now we fixed it. Well, the issue was much deeper into the soil. Like there's a reason why the culture became a gossip fest. It was the meetings after the meetings because no one felt safe to share in the meeting space. And so they would go to their safe person and then share with that person. And then they would commiserate together and all these types of things. So a lot of the work wasn't just, hey, we're not going to gossip. Of course, that was involved. But it was getting below it and saying, hey, how do we create safety within our staff culture in which people can feel free to express their opinions when everybody's in the room. There's a reason why no one felt permission to do so. So
the gossip was like a symptom of a deeper cause.
Yeah. Another example would be if a church culture, a staff culture is sort of lead pastor centric. Everything revolves around the authority that the lead pastor has. What quickly ends up happening is everybody is sort of pivoting to be in good relational standing with that leader, and they're not truly empowered to make decisions on their own. And so that can create a staff culture that gets pretty messy because those who are more proximate to the lead pastor or in good standing, at least in that moment, sort of get to wield power and get their way over other staff members. Like at any moment, they get sort of the trump card to have their way simply by being proximate to the right person. That's very different. That is very different from maybe a leadership team like the one we've been trying to create, where many people are empowered and it's not revolving around one person. It's about our shared values being lived out together, right?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have had experiences with other churches that not only was it leader-centric in the unsaid practices, but also in the structure. It was very well known who's in charge.
Yeah.
And it was a smaller church, but like a very small church. But if you wanted to talk to the pastor, you were scheduling it out a month in advance. When if you were another staff member wanting to talk to the lead pastor about something, it was scheduling it out a month or longer in advance when they're right down the hallway because they're maintaining this position of, no, I'm exercising authority by making sure that everyone has to orient around me because I'm the one who's anointed for it, essentially.
Right. So notice the metaphor. Let's connect the metaphor to these examples. In the first one, if gossip is in the soil, the fruit on the tree is relational dysfunction and brokenness, right? If senior pastor centrism is in the soil, the result is all sorts of power grabbing and proximate game playing. That's the fruit. And maybe to cast vision for where we're going in this series is some of it's going to be hard work because we're going to be naming, here's a prominent toxin that is in the soil of the American church. And we're not doing that, again, from, as you named, Josiah, a self-righteous place, but allowing that toxin to humble us and examine ourselves. So for the next few episodes, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be naming some toxins that are prominent in the American church and share with you some of the ways that we have tried to reckon with that and are trying to reckon with that as a church. And then from there, we're going to begin going, okay, but here are the sort of positive fertilizer we want to be putting into the soil to produce good fruit.
And we want you to join us in that.
And we want you to be a part of that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
These podcasts are not just about imparting information. They're saying, here's our vision as a church. We want you to live into this with us.
Yeah, I did think of an example of sort of a positive effect of the lack of the leader-centric model for the toxin in the soil. We know a couple from our church who felt a while ago that there was sort of a gap in they felt very isolated in being a blended family and felt like there was a lack of support and resources for that. And in a model in which everything has to go from top down, people lack empowerment to be able to step into something they might feel called to. So rather than looking at that as like, this church doesn't meet my needs, they felt prompted by the Holy Spirit to maybe there's other people too who are feeling isolated and want and need support in that area.
Yeah.
So they just started. There's like they just, I don't know. They did all the work. They came to us with some of the idea and said, "Can you announce it so that people can come to our house if they just come to our house and hang out and maybe we can try to support each other." I mean, there wasn't a huge plan, but the point about the whole story is that people ended up coming anyway, and it's an ongoing thing. And I think that the win from that isn't necessarily all the people who are affected. The win from that is they sensed a need and didn't feel like it was necessarily the church's or the leadership's job to go make sure every need was met. They saw it as, no, we are the church. We are part of the body. We're sensing a need. And rather than coming at it from a consumeristic mindset, I can choose to step in and be empowered and maybe be a part of what God wants to do in this community.
I think I know who you're talking about.
Yes.
The bogies.
Yes.
And they're awesome. I mean, you're right. Not only did they feel empowered to do that, but I have met countless people who were part of that group and were positively impacted by that space. May their tribe multiply. You know what I mean?
Yes.
What a gift to our community. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're talking when we say we want to invite you to be a part of it. That's what we mean. That's shaping our culture.
Yeah.
Right? It's as we lean in together and there's this interaction between leadership and congregation that shapes the sum total of our culture together.
Yeah. Yeah. And our entire church community will become more of a network for not just meeting needs, but genuine flourishing of people within our community and outside. I mean, think of all the countless stories we have of people being generous, and they were generous in ways in which us as the leadership would not have even seen if people weren't empowered to be the church and to be a healthy, flourishing community.
100%. 100%.
So, yeah, I want that, and I know you guys do, and I hope everyone listening would see a positive vision for what that could look like and want to be a part of making it happen.
Yeah, I love that.
So, yeah, let's shift to practices, right? I know that today is more of an intro to the series, but I think that trying to keep with what our value is for this podcast, let's talk about what are some action steps and practices we might have after listening to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I would say it just starts with kind of noticing your church culture. You know, if you're a member of Crosspoint, that applies here. If you go to another church, just start to kind of be aware of some of the things we've talked about. And it's important to keep in mind that, again, no church is perfect. As we've said, churches are full of broken people. So I think it's important not to kind of take this as a license to use it as an opportunity to like get really critical and call out any little problem you see. But we do want to be discerning. We want to be aware. We want to be asking, like, what are the signs of health? What are the signs of unhealth? How do we know? What are the leaves and fruit, the trunk, the branches, the soil, like Mac talked about? Do the things people do and say really match what the church says it's about, or does it kind of feel more like talk? Like what they say sounds good from the stage, but the life of the church doesn't really match up to that. So just being aware.
Yeah,
noticing.
And that's hard work. And it can feel threatening to some people, right? Mm-hmm. If you're part of another church, for instance, and you start taking a look at what's in the soil and you notice some things that, maybe you shouldn't be there. Well, if you have the courage to name those things, it's going to be disruptive. It disrupts the homeostasis in that community, Mm-hmm. So I just encourage you. This is hard work.
Yeah.
So let's be kind to each other.
Yep.
Let's be kind to each other as we go about this. When you say, Katie, none of us are perfect, and we've said that a few times, no church is perfect. I don't hear that as like a cop-out. Hey, I'm not perfect, so just let me be where I am. That's not what we're saying. But the fact that this gap exists everywhere ought to just help us lean in with humility and kindness, knowing it's hard work.
Yeah, and to your point, when you do notice something, how you raise it matters.
Yes.
Right? A lot. And the response will be indicative of the culture, right? How you're received when you raise a concern or a question or you press into something, like notice how the church responds to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we are imperfect, it would be ridiculous to not have some sort of expectation and plan for what happens when messes happen. If you don't, if you know we're not perfect, it shouldn't be surprising to see these things. And on top of that, the reaction doesn't need to be ignore it. It needs to be, no, we can face it because we can normalize the fact that it won't be perfect. And that'll allow us to be much more humble and aware of what's going on.
Which maybe a practice underneath this first one would be, we did that episode on how to clean up messes.
Yeah.
And that entails both when you've made a mess, how to go about initiating cleaning up your own mess, but also how to maybe bring that to someone else when they've created a mess that they don't know about. So feel free to go back and review. Maybe a second practice I'd name is just to prioritize health and healing. And I have a specific group of people in mind when I name this practice, and it's those who have been hurt by a church. I've met many people over the years who have been hurt in some way within the context of a church. I want to say some of that's just unavoidable. We're a bunch of broken people crashing into one another. There's not a single relationship I've had in my life that hasn't involved some hurt or pain if there's depth to it, right? So this is unavoidable, but some forms of church hurt, and maybe I'd want to distinguish between just hurt and abuse. It's really painful for people. I've met people who have been abused by pastors sexually. I've met people who have been bullied by pastors who have power. I've met people who, when they express concerns, have experienced gaslighting and been blamed. So there's all kinds of ways that people have been hurt within the context of a church. And maybe just a word of pastoral care. I want you to know that Jesus cares about you. He sees your pain. He's present to you and wants to bring about healing. And I would just encourage you to lean into, accept Jesus's embrace and healing in your life. And even if that means maybe stepping away from a church that's unhealthy for a season of time to experience that healing, I would just want to give people permission to do that. If you're in an unhealthy place that continues to perpetuate pain, maybe it's time to step away from that. And so you can attend to your own healing and re-engage in a better place.
Another practice would be just to clarify your own agency and responsibility. I know we just talked about that a second ago, but we all have responsibility for the cultures we participate in, right? We talked about, if you're a leader, you have probably a greater responsibility to culture, but that doesn't mean that we don't have some sort of agency, even if you are a irregular attender. We're all collectively the church, even globally in some fashion. So I think that when we try to excuse ourselves from any bit of responsibility when things go wrong, I don't think it does good work. It produces pride, like I'm better than you, rather than a sense of humility in which we're in this together and we need to figure it out together. So, if you want to be a part of a healthy church, it starts with you first, being able to show up in a healthy way and to notice that.
In my work with the leader's journey, sometimes we're invited into really messy situations. And this one it's public, so it's not like a secret. But this particular church had a youth pastor that sexually abused some students. And some of my colleagues at the leader's journey have been invited into some of the repair work. And one of the things that they did was they led those who remain in the church through an exercise where they had to talk about or identify themselves as upstanders, someone who speaks up for those who are being mistreated, or bystanders, someone who remains quiet when others are being mistreated. And it was an exercise to help draw awareness to what we've been naming throughout this episode, which is we're all in this together. Like all of you were in some way participating in the cultural result that we're now sitting in. And oftentimes what happens, and Scott and Laura name this, is when there's toxic leadership, you'll find a bunch of enablers and sort of bystanders and accomplices sort of rallying around that person, which is counter to a community of Tov.
Yeah. They have a term for that. Sycophants? Is that how you say it? Right? Is that how you pronounce it? Sycophant?
Yeah. Sycophant.
I have not heard this.
It's in the book.
Oh, okay.
I'm
trying to think of the word.
Yeah. And I just read it at 3 a.m. So I liked it because it talked about how when you've got a lead pastor-centric model, people tend to appease that either because there's fear there and they're scared of standing up, but also because as that lead pastor then brings other people into their circle and shows favoritism, that feels good, right? So people like that status enhancement they get from being under the favor of the lead pastor.
Sycophant.
I had the end in the wrong place.
Yes, sycophant. That reminds me. There's in Batman Begins, I think. There's this moment where the guy who plays Batman, he wants to clear out his house. He's having a big party, and he accuses all of them present of being sycophants, and then they sort of disperse. Like he has offended them. All right,
cultural reference to the word.
Yeah.
That helps.
All right, all right. Big picture, you guys. Quick summary: every church has a culture. Whether we realize it or not, that culture shapes and influences us both positively and negatively, and we're inviting all of you to be part of closing this gap as we pursue, albeit not perfectly, but pursue a healthy culture at Crosspoint.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Next time, in light of everything we've been discussing, we're going to talk about some of the toxins that have found their way into the soil of the American church and what we can do to remove them. So we hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you'll continue to tune in.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.